Hello, folks. Welcome back to a new week on World War II TV and the first of a double bill. We have Rick Green, who's in the audience right now, back again in a few hours' time to talk about with his presentation. But our understanding of politics in wartime Britain is through the lens of Churchill's coalition government and beyond 1945 through Labour's radical new vision. Kit Kowol, in his book Blue Jerusalem, I'll hold up my copy here, makes the case that leading Conservatives also used the war to develop new ideas for a better Britain post-victory. So I'll bring him in now. It's evening where he is, morning where I am. So good evening, Kit. How are you today?
Hi, yeah. Hello from Brisbane, Australia.
Good. So we were just talking before going live there about the complicated but also really fascinating themes your book brings up, and it doesn't fit into any really kind of shelf I have on my library of, well, does it go in with the Churchill books? No, not really. Does it go in with Daniel Tobin and Animal? Well, sort of. But before we get into the conversation, where did the idea come from?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks so much for having me. So the book actually took twice as long to write as the Second World War took to fight, which partly down to obviously all of the rigorous archival research, but also the fact of moving continents not once but twice. So in some ways, what the book is about kind of changed over time a little bit. So I started it really, and this was kind of coming out of my PhD, and I was trying, if you think about it, 2010, we're thinking kind of Cameron era, 2014 Cameron era, and it's a particular type of conservatism. It's kind of together with the Lib Dems, it's quite kind of safe in some respects. It's not desperately kind of combative and ideological. It's not actually super kind of hopeful either, particularly at the time when you're thinking about post-crash kind of movements on the left. They were seen as being like the radical and hopeful and utopian stuff. And I was kind of looking around and at different kind of, I've always been interested in conservative movements. And I kind of found myself almost accidentally looking at stuff to do with the Second World War. And I found these kind of amazing pamphlets and articles and books and journals by these kind of forgotten conservatives with these really kind of big and radical and exciting, hopeful visions of the future. And I just kind of wanted to kind of write about them and kind of bring them back to life. So, I mean, just to give you a flavor about it. So you kind of got people who think that companies are and firms are really the model for the way in which a whole society should be run, who kind of think of this, you could have paternalist owners and you could overcome the battles between capital and labor on the one hand together, and how, you could get rid of the House of Lords and replace it with a House of Industry. And have employers on one side and labor on the other hand, and they could work together and bash out this kind of national plan. And maybe you could expand this globally and have kind of a federation between kind of Britain and the US. So it's kind of these really kind of big, exciting ideas that, compared to kind of the austerity years where politics kind of seems small and a little bit mean. And kind of and the opposite end of these kind of the spectrum of these kind of almost kind of what we might think of these days as kind of Anglo-futurist Tories, where kind of people who were looking completely the opposite direction and kind of wanting to take Britain back to the land, make Britain self-sufficient in food and have every person have, almost turn the whole nation into kind of one big refrigerator, have geese being grazed on the roadside and everyone growing their own food, and the aristocrat being kind of revived as the example of kind of ultimate kind of leadership. And then turning out that they were all massively into organic farming, which just, it just didn't seem to fit with the politics as I was experiencing it. So, I mean, that was kind of what got me started. But I see after a while, kind of really, and I must kind of credit, I ended up working a lot with David Edgerton at King's College London, who's kind of the author of, wonderful, wonderful books on British history across the 20th century. and including the Second World War, and really delving a little bit more into kind of the historiography around the Second World War, and coming to realize just how dominant a particular story about the Second World War was. This kind of story that the Second World War is the people's war. It's all the people kind of coming together, and you kind of instinctively growing up, or certainly I growing up as a kid, kind of had this vision. The things you latch onto are stuff like Dunkirk, and this idea of the little ships. Here's a vision of the people literally coming to kind of rescue the nation. And this idea that, the political history of the war is really about telling a story of how Britain ends up with a Labour government in 1945. And it's a story that's really all about the rise of the left and the development of the welfare state. And then really thinking like, well, my Tories don't really kind of fit into this. So what's really going on? And I ended up arguing that, actually, in many ways, the Second World War was a Tories' war rather than a people's war. It wasn't for democracy necessarily, and certainly not for socialism and social democracy. It was fought in the main for the maintenance of the British Empire and the British, in some ways, the British class system as well, the British kind of economic settlement. And if you look at kind of who's really in charge during the war, it is Conservatives, both, not just kind of Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden, but lots of Conservatives all the way up and down the government, kind of unsurprisingly, because they were the dominant force in the wartime coalition, and they used their power in government to actually in many ways push quite a conservative agenda that was often kind of interestingly like about the militarization of society, or pushing Christian, the Christianization of society. Really trying to challenge that notion of a people's war, and give it kind of nuance it and broaden it out, and suggest there were other ways in which people thought about the war at the time, and actually other ways that we can think about it too.
Well, that's a great introduction, and that's what I really enjoyed about reading it, is giving me ideas I didn't know I needed, these ideas, and this whole concept of people's differing visions for what Britain is. And I think one of the things that we talked about before going live is about language, and what is Britain, and what is a vision, what are the people, who are the people. And if there's one thing you can do in a wartime situation is get ideas through pretty quickly. That's in peacetime, ideas will have to percolate and go through committees and subcommittees and read. But in the war, you can get things through the House effectively very, very quickly, and that works whatever government you're talking about. And I hadn't realized how many things that I grew up with taking for granted were established during World War II. One of the notes I've written down is that being taught a religious education in state schools was brought through in World War II. For some reason, I would have thought that had been in place before then. I would have thought that would have gone back to the 19th century. When I realized that came through, was it 44 that came through? That was, I didn't realize that was relatively so late. And the Christian values that were being put forward by some of these conservative leaders, I found really interesting as well. So that's something, an avenue we can go down. But the language is particular. And I want to bring you back before to what you said about the Dunkirk and the little ships and things, because this is a recurring theme on the channel. We've looked at the little ships. We've looked at the fact that the streets of London weren't that safe in World War II. We looked at the blackout murders about 10 days ago, for example, things like that. These almost warm and cuddly jumper type memories that we think we have of the war. But I say, you and I weren't there in the war, so they're not our memories, but we've somehow adopted other people's memories as being our own. And I think through all of this, as you said there, and I said at the beginning, Churchill looms large in all of this, and these images we have are hard to derail in some ways. So let's go back to some of the leading figures within the Conservative Party, who are names that we probably don't know now, but were quite big back in the time. And one of the names I've written down, John Baker White and his book. So let's talk about him.
So I mean, I start off with John Baker White, and can I just go back to what you were saying?
Please do.
Like Dunkirk and the little ships, because I think what we have to remember is that these ideas about what the war was about and who it was for and why it was being fought was something that were being constructed at the time.
Yeah, and challenged at the time. Yeah.
And challenged at the time. And absolutely, that, you know, there were different ideas and people were pushing them for very different reasons. So the guy who is most famous for, you know, doing this amazing broadcast that talks about the little ships is a guy called Joseph Priestley, and who's a Labour figure. And he's trying to push a type of socialism that's about, you know, celebrating the ordinary working man, and saying that they are special and important, and this links very much into kind of George Orwell's way of thinking about the war. That Britain is a wonderful country, but with the wrong people in charge. So it's a very English socialism. But there were, like, as I talk about at the time, kind of Tories who were trying to push a very different picture of what Dunkirk was about. And I think one of the things that I found really fascinating at the time was Tories saying, look, you know, Dunkirk is great, but actually the thing we should really be celebrating is the Siege of Calais. And that this is an example of, you know, how Brigadier Nicholson kind of refuses to surrender even though he can't be rescued, and you know, this is an example for them of trying to tell a story about elite, kind of high class military leadership, as opposed to kind of, you know, the ordinary people. So I think every time we kind of come across like an idea about the Second World War and where it comes from, you know, often it is kind of memories and how it was, you know, portrayed later in film and written about in books, and they all have their own kind of political agendas. But we've also got to remember that the war was a political fight at the time, and things were, you know, very much a clash of ideas throughout.
Now that thing you just said there about going back to the little ships again, and the idea of it being challenged at the time, because we think of the idea that Britain standing alone and being dependent on little ships is a new thing, but as you make in the point in the book, it was being challenged then. And actually, some people say no. What the success, if it is a success of Dunkirk, and it is, but it's, as Churchill said, you know, you don't win wars by running away, essentially, is that the people were saying, no, it's not the little people, the people that were involved. It was a very, very organized military system. The Battle of Britain ties into that. We now understand, thanks to the writing of people like Dilip Sarkar and James Holland, that it was a integrated air defense system that actually won us the Battle of Britain, not little housewives giving their frying pans to make Spitfires. That kind of idea that it was the people winning the Battle of Britain. The people had their role in terms of keeping up morale and collecting newspapers and paper for all that kind of stuff there, but actually it was a system that had been put in place by the establishment, essentially. But that then at the time wasn't necessarily what they were, or what some people were trying to push as the reason. So Priestley and Orwell, who I grew up with being very influential figures in my teen years, but I don't know that I was given the influential conservative view in my teen years, because that wasn't what was being taught.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and particularly, and you know, there's a reason why this kind of way of thinking about the war kind of comes to dominate. And you kind of talk about Britain alone, like so during the war, you get Tories who are very, very constantly trying to stress the importance of empire, because they're trying to, you know, think about a future of empire, and they're speaking to the empire. I mean, after the war, and Tories do this for their own. You know, Churchill is you know, notorious for it. I mean, pushing the kind of Britain, you know, standing alone without an empire. Not kind of stressing the imperial element of it. That's about a kind of an argument he's having with the Americans, saying kind of, you owe us. So you do get these ways in which kind of ideas from left and right kind of end up kind of merging for different, but everyone's got a different political reason for doing what they're doing. And particularly in the 1960s, at a time when Britain is, you know, for some people on the left, like Britain's imperial past is something you want to kind of not stress too much. You're thinking about post-imperial future, talking about the home front, your women, wives collecting saucepans. That's that's what we want to be talking about, not kind of great kind of generals strutting around with moustaches. But that, of course, is not the only way it can be told, and wasn't the only way it was told at the time. People forget that before. People think so. J.B. Priestley does this thing called postscripts, and this kind of broadcast in the evening, and people think that his broadcast is like the only one on Dunkirk, but actually, like the night before, there had been a broadcast by the director of intelligence for the BEF, who gives an entirely different account of what's happened and why it's happened, stressing those kind of elite figures.
So, which brings us to the idea of the fact that during a war, the population are to some extent brought together, because in adversity, in triumph, you bring people together, and you're putting people in. It's an era of organizations and associations. People get together for civil defense, they get together for morale, they get together just to get things done and send off socks to the troops, things like that. And I think one of the things your book alerted me to is that everybody's seeing that groups of people coming together are useful. They are a useful tool to bring these people under whatever banner you want to bring them in under for your visions of the future. And I just don't think I'd realize how many people are thinking beyond the war, because I think when you're thinking of it as we do on the channel in terms of, they're not thinking about 1943 in 1942. They're not even thinking about the next month in 42. It's let's get this battle done. Let's get this battle done. And we now know there's an outcome, and that all of these battles lead eventually to a victory. But in the political sphere, people, I think, are more moves ahead in the chess game they're playing in their head. And people really have very, very strong ideas, who said there, about empire, and about whether or not, you said earlier about we should go back to this kind of idea of the gentry, the landowner, and village life, and so this is kind of radical that people are having these ideas. So is it people that were sort of in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, people who are perhaps a little bit beyond the military age, who are the ones within the Conservative Party who can sit down and have these ideas? It's not the Young Turks, because as you made the point in the earlier chapters, there are Conservative members of Parliament who are being killed in 1940 because even if their visions for the future are maybe not perhaps in line with a military system, they are still doing their bit for country. So it's a little bit more not older but less young Conservatives.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And actually, I hadn't really thought too much about the age profile. But yeah, it does. You're probably right. It does tend to be people who are a little bit older, and I think it's also people who remember what happened after the First World War.
Yeah.
And there is the story that we get that Never Again, which is the title of Peter Hennessy's kind of great book on the post-war period, and was a kind of mantra. We're not going to go back to, on the left, a mantra on the left, we're not going to have the same kind of fate for people kind of being thrown on the scrap heap after coming back from the trenches in World War One. And you have people on the right who think, have similar concerns, because although the Conservative Party dominated in many ways the post-First World War period, many people weren't happy with the kind of country that came out of it. And they have those kind of worries about, will we see a kind of, we need to start planning and thinking about more seriously about the post-war world than we did back in 1918. We need to start doing it now. I mean, there was nearly a revolution in Britain in 1919. That was like as close as Britain kind of got.
USA got close as well, didn't they?
Yeah, and you think about what happened in Ireland. So they are thinking in those terms and drawing on their experience from the First World War period. I think they're also, and this is one of the things that, this was a gigantic catastrophe, like an absolute catastrophe. The whole kind of never again thing, never going to go through a horrific war like First World War, and yet it's happening, really does kind of, for some people it's literally apocalyptical. If you think about the firebombing of cities and things like that, the world seems aflame. And yeah, it does produce this kind of great kind of groundswell of thinking that, we've got to do stuff, and we've got to think big, because, the world is impinging on us in a big, big way. And which makes for a really interesting type of conservatism, whether that's thinking big in like a kind of hyper modern way, or if it's saying, oh, no, modernity itself is the problem. You've got to go back. So it's the scale of the thing that I think really drives a lot of these ideas.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to say I'm thoroughly enjoying this conversation. Let's bring up John Baker White, because I think
sure.
And there's another thing I want to touch on with that as well, is how the advantage of the war bringing allowing people's ideas to come to fruition is on the one hand, but the other thing is things move very, very fast in World War II. So an idea in 1942 that would seem radical then, by 1945 events have overtaken it so completely that idea is stuck in the past. We've got a question that I'll put to you later on from other viewers about what the Conservative ideas made it their 1945 election sort of manifesto, and how different they are from some of the things being said even just 2 or 3, even a year earlier. I really like the fact you started your book with White and his book there. So I'd like to expand on that a little bit, please.
Yeah. So very few people have heard of John Baker White. So he was he's a very interesting character. He comes from his mother is someone who's trying to kind of reclaim lost fortune, and is always going off on kind of dalliances and wild kind of business schemes that will go horribly wrong. And he ends up kind of at one point joins the circus, and he goes out to Africa, as seemingly every kind of right-wing upper-class person does, and tries to make his fortune. It doesn't really work, and he gets involved in lots of kind of right-wing strike-breaking organizations. So one in particular called the Economic League. So if your manufacturing business is on strike, you call up the Economic League, and basically they organize your blacklegs, your scabs, to break the strike. He gets involved with them, and he gets quite kind of interested in Nazi Germany in 1930. He goes to Nuremberg. He thinks that like Hitler maybe needs to tone down the Jewish stuff, but he's kind of restored Germany's spirit. And it's all a bit, and his Who's Who entry that's kind of written, in the 1950s, kind of rather tones down these. Doesn't really mention so many of his writings at the time. And during the war, he kind of leaves the Economic League. He signs. He's a member of the London Rifle Brigade or Regiment. I'm sorry, military people out there. I haven't got the name in front of me. And kind of uses his time, because like most soldiers, he's kind of bored all the time, to write these incredibly evocative letters, often, and articles. And there's, he writes about the kind of new spirit of Britain that he sees in working with soldiers, so the sons of peasants and peers working together. So this kind of cross-class coming together, but underneath kind of military leadership, and the way in which Britons are becoming strong and manly again. And they're spending more time digging trenches and less time betting on dogs. And he kind of sees this kind of new world that can be built out of it. And he also does some kind of fascinating stuff in the war, because he'd been involved in a little bit of naval intelligence towards the end of the First World War, and his kind of links to the Economic League. He's very good at propaganda. And he is one of the people who comes up with these kind of disinformation campaigns. So one of the things he promotes is this idea that Britain could set the sea on fire in event of an invasion. And despite or perhaps because of his kind of pre-war history, he gets selected to be a Conservative Party MP candidate in 1945 for Canterbury. He wins, and then goes on to have a very interesting career in Parliament, essentially as the sort of Joseph McCarthy figure for the UK in the post-war period. This is not in the book, but he goes on and essentially believes there's pushes a Red Scare. This idea that they're communists underneath the bed, and they are, they're in control of the BBC, and they're trying to kind of change the minds of the British people. And his idea that, look at what we did with disinformation during the Second World War, and this is what's happening to us again. But he's just like a little snapshot of the kind of interesting, different kind of types of conservatives, many of whom had flirted with fascism in the 1930s. Because they didn't know what fascism would, what would happen, or that fascism was doomed. They saw it, as maybe a potential kind of alternative. Lots of people were questioning the value of democracy. So yeah, just a little snapshot of the kind of intellectual milieu of the era.
I mean, there were some really quite astonishing figures, and some that you're surprised kind of even survived the 1939, 1940, because we think of it, we framework that through Chamberlain going, Churchill coming in, but there are of course people that were sort of pro-Chamberlain, anti-Churchill, that kind of moved their allegiance, and the other way around, and people who were just kind of bent with the breeze and just tried to keep their own role there, and then new kids on the block who came through afterwards. And it's interesting as well that we think of that because Churchill was the leader, we think of it as being a conservative government, but some conservatives weren't really thinking of it as a conservative government because it is a coalition. There are people from the other side of the house there, so they're both kind of all sides of the house, and in the middle kind of they're thinking that actually this is just a limbo now. There isn't really a government in charge in conventional ways. So now is the time to kind of put forward our case for what the next era will be, when a real conservative government will get in, as opposed to this pretend one that we're all kind of putting up with now to get this pesky war out of the way. And I don't think I quite realized that. Another thing I wanted to expand on is Rab Butler, who looms large as well through the book, who is another figure that I knew about him in the back of my head, but had sort of dropped from my radar. But he definitely is one of those ones who survives various kind of eras and changes by being kind of adaptable to some extent, but yet also has vision. So can we talk about him, please?
Yeah. So Rab, R.A. Butler, Rab to everyone who knew him. So like you, I'd only kind of come across him through looking at kind of post-war British history as a kind of name. So you've probably heard of Butskellism. Yeah. So this is the idea of a kind of consensus type of politics in the 50s, in particularly in the 60s, with Butler on the right and Hugh Gaitskell, the leader of the Labour Party, in a sense that actually, they weren't that different after all. And Butler kind of very much plays up to this idea. I mean, his title of his memoirs is The Art of the Possible. So he's like, politics and conservatism is all about pragmatism. And then during the war, I kind of come across these articles that he writes kind of calling for a kind of a new Christian civilization and a new Christian state, and flirting with ideas that might seem a little bit, well, actually saying we might need a dose of totalitarianism here. Writing in 1940 when totalitarianism seems to be winning. So he's thinking, oh well, a more organized state. Actually, how can we do that while kind of preserving some of the great kind of British liberties that you have? And the answer that he and quite a lot of conservatives come to, and to that mind, actually figures on the left. And I think we do need to kind of acknowledge that. The breadth and this thinking that wasn't just happening on the right, the kind of radicalism and utopianism was across the political spectrum, and that came to religion as well. But for Rab Butler, his answer to how do we get the kind of discipline and order that we need, that totalitarian regimes supply and seem to be what you need to win a war, with kind of British liberties like freedom of speech and assembly, is that, well, you've got to embed this all within a deeply Christian culture, which respects the sanctity of the individual life. So you don't end up killing millions of people just because of who they are. You respect individuals. And he, along with some other conservatives, are interested in things like almost creating a kind of a new Christian elite. These are the people that could only really be trusted to handle the kind of great power that a totalitarian state, an organized state, would provide. And he is, thinking about how to do it, and he kind of ends up at the Board of Education, where he pushes through the creation of grammar schools. Yeah. So there's your kind of elite element, but also pushing through, as you talked about earlier, the compulsory Christian education, which I think we don't actually, I think, grasp just how important that Christian element was at the time to people. It was seen as, people have been wanting this for a long time, some on the right, and never been able to achieve it. And for them, this was the real achievement of the 44 Education Act, much more than anything else, was this embedding of kind of almost a national type of Christian, a kind of shared Christian code of conduct and code of education that would kind of be the basis for British civilization, one that was actually projected by the state. So here's the church and state coming together, which is itself a kind of very old.
Yeah, I mean, that's idea. Right now in 2024, that sounds odd, because that's, in the USA, particularly, that whole separation of church and state is always being talked about in various ways there. But the idea of actually using religion and Christianity to kind of, in a good way, bring people together is something I hadn't really thought about. And it's like, the other thing that your book is reminding me is that there are, despite the fact that obviously the Allies are trying to defeat a terrible enemy in the Third Reich and the Japanese, there are little bits about the way that Germany is functioning under the Third Reich that they're not envious of per se, but they're like this idea of getting the people, the general populace, behind some idea that isn't that isn't state, but it's something beyond a state. And that's where I can see the kind of using Christianity to kind of fill that gap, as you say there. It's got this idea of bringing people behind an ideology, but a good ideology, as opposed to a shit, horrible, murdering other people ideology. And I hadn't kind of thought about this idea of trying to harness some of the way, looking at the ways that the Axis are galvanizing their population and kind of borrowing from it, but turning the idea around into something very quintessentially British moving forward.
Yeah, and of course, these politicians are trying to appeal to their own party audiences, the British public, but they're also speaking to people overseas. Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that the Nazis offer is this kind of new German New World Order, which is designed to prevent the kind of economic insecurity that had plagued Europe during the 1920s and 30s. So essentially a kind of a German economic Lebensraum. And if you were an unemployed Belgian coal miner or something, at times that could seem quite appealing. And so the Allies are trying to come up with their own ideas for this, their own proposals, their own sort of attractions, why you should kind of, believe in us as well, and say we're not going to go back to what there was before. So alongside these kind of domestic ideas about politics, you've also got kind of really big kind of international ones. So I mentioned this idea of Britain and America actually federating, and maybe even going further, maybe a global federation is an idea that gets talked about and is thought, interested people on the right as well. Or maybe we need a world of, economic blocks like the Germans have suggested, but we'll have a European bloc and a British bloc and a American bloc, and these are the future, and this will stabilize the international order. So I think, yeah, really important to remember just the variety of people that they're talking to at this time, which shapes what they're saying and how they say it.
Well, I'm thoroughly enjoying this. Another thing I really want to bring up is education, because both sides of the spectrum, all sides, they're all realizing that you've got this sort of captive audience. You've got thousands of people on ships, you've got thousands of people on airfields, in armies, and now is the time to give them the tools to think about a new Britain. And again, we're being careful to include that can mean Britain both domestically, but also Britain and its empire and its affiliations and countries. And so education, and there are various reports that came out in the war, and the Beveridge report came up in the sidebar there and things like that. And there are ideas about reforming the welfare state from across the parties there. But education is the one I want to sort of bring in. Everyone realizes that is going to be a really important tool, is get the people armed for something. But of course, we're back in this conflict of different visions for the future. So what were the Conservative ideas behind educating the people who are at war, and what they could be educating them for post-victory?
Well, I mean, one of the things that happens particularly after the war, one of the reasons that Conservatives give in 1945 for their huge defeat to Labour is the sense that Labour has been using education, particularly education of the troops overseas, through this thing called ABCA, the Army Bureau of Current Affairs, to push their very own, push their particular point of view. Now, historians have largely kind of discredited the influence of ABCA in terms of actually shaping votes and influencing the election outcome too much. But it was a big concern at the time, and one of the reasons why Tories get into this game of battle of producing pamphlets and producing speeches and journals is they worry that the other side are doing it better. So they're having to do a bit more of it themselves. But at the same time, they're like a bit torn, because they're like, well, let's not, some of them are like, well, let's not focus too much on the future. Let's get on with the fighting. So there's always this slight tension within the Tories. And we tended to focus on those people who are like, don't bloody ABCA people, just learn how to bayonet someone. But there were others who are really trying to push their own vision at the time. And it's those people I do tend to focus on in the book.
And I think we ought to bring up 1945, because some Conservative leaders had predicted the defeat. For others, it was a complete surprise. But the scale of the defeat surprised even those that were kind of half expecting it, didn't it? And you mentioned it there, that the education isn't possibly a reason. Your book doesn't. You don't try to really explain, in a sense. Your book isn't about why did the Conservative lose the 45 election, but of course it's part of the story there. In writing this book, do you think you kind of hit the reason why the Conservatives lost and lost so badly?
Look, I think the reasons broadly there are three main reasons why the Conservative Party loses the election. Like the first one is Tories have usually enjoyed a massive organisational advantage over the Labour Party. They had more money, they had more, often had more volunteers. They were much more, in many ways, more organised. And the party does kind of shut down a little bit of its kind of official organisation during the war, which is actually why you get this kind of blossoming of people on the fringes coming out with these ideas. And that certainly doesn't help the party. The other reason is that, I mean, as much as the people I write about are kind of interested in kind of the big picture, visions of the future, is often for many people on the ground, it is of the day-to-day concerns of like, you know, I've been bombed out of my house. Where am I going to live? The food is, you know, rations are crap. I'd really like better, more food. Who's the best place to provide that? And there was the sense, because of the Tories' kind of pre-war record, that actually the Labour Party were a better place to fix some of those concrete elements. And the third element is that the Tories had always benefited, and you see this time and time and again. It's a classic kind of play that they've done for, you know, generations, is to present the Conservative Party as the patriotic party.
Yep.
And Labour as the one that's kind of dangerous, ideological,
trying to throw away traditions and things like that.
Yeah. And you can't really make that argument when you've got Clement Attlee standing like right next to you if you're Winston Churchill. It's very hard to say that Labour has been unpatriotic or trade unions have been unpatriotic when, you know, you've been celebrating the tanks that are produced for Russia.
That's a very good point.
It just doesn't, that play. They try it a bit. And that's why, you know, Churchill tries it with his kind of famous Gestapo speech, this idea that Labour would, if elected, would need some kind of secret police to be able to implement the type of socialism they want, which is as close as you can possibly get to saying like they're unpatriotic, they didn't believe in the war, they were really on the side of the Nazis. It just doesn't, it doesn't ring true. If they're so bad, why have you been working with them for 5 years?
Yeah.
So those kind of three reasons, I think, are the main ones that lead to the Labour victory in 45. And it is a huge victory. And one of the things I try and stress in the book is just how different the Britain of post 45 is to the Britain of the Second World War, because there is a temptation to say, because, you know, there was a bit of because there was things like an emergency health service, there was emergency medical service developed during the war. You can kind of see these, you see the kind of the germs of post-war Britain emerging during the Second World War, and I try and kind of argue the opposite, actually, and that to stress just how, you know, yes, people were sent down the mines by the state during the war, but they were sent down private mines. There was very few. The welfare state was, you know, reasonable if you were involved in the military, but absolutely shocking if you were old or if you were a child.
I mean, that one of the things, to interrupt you, the things that I learned from your book is that, you know, that benefits for people who'd lost legs and things like that, and people who were suffering from mental illnesses, better in the war if you were military, but for civilians, almost nothing at all. There was help being provided, but it was divided by whether you were part of the military or not part of the military. Whereas Labour did try and at least bring that into a universal healthcare and universal benefit. It doesn't matter whether you've served or not served. The victory has been won by everybody, so everybody will benefit for them. Not so that's something you reminded me of in the book, which I'm grateful for. As we get towards the end of this, I think one of the things that some of my favorite military historians on the channel they don't like the what ifs. They don't like what if history. They don't like the alternative. What's the point? We only can study what happened. So to wind things down, we know that the Conservatives lost the election in 1945. We know that Attlee and Bevan, all those guys are there, and the health service comes about. So to kind of a provocative question, what's the point of studying what the Conservatives had planned because it didn't happen? Basically, what can we learn from their ideas that are relevant, especially now, 80 years on?
Well, I think for Conservatives, you learn an awful lot about, you know, what conservatism has been and can be, and we're, you know, when I was writing it was writing at a time when conservatism was quite boring, quite, you know, the ghost of Margaret Thatcher hung very heavy. over, and I was trying to argue that no, there's lots of different types of conservatism out there, and there are lots of different ways of being a conservative. I think so, but not everyone's a conservative, far from it. And but there's I think a bigger reason why it's important to study these kind of failed ideas, and that's to kind of realize that these things fail because of contingency. We are not our paths are not destined. Some things could have been very different. A small change. There was this genuine possibility that was pushed in the war of an Franco-British Union during the war. And if we need to hang on to these ideas to recognize the contingency of our present and just how different things could be. Partly if we want it, but we have to want it, and we have to argue for it, and we have to think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And I think, we talked about before going live. I still maintain that Labour government of 45 is one of the best the British have ever had. But of course, it didn't reduce taxes like some people were hoping for. Rationing kept on going for a few more years. It brought great things that we now wish were still as great as they were. National Health Service, I'm looking in your direction. But also the Conservatives had perhaps a different vision for 1945 that would have not brought the same things, but would have brought different things that might also have benefited the country, because we are at this point where we're 80 years on, and we've seen the if you like, the butcher's bill in some ways of the Labour government was then the things happening in the next decades. And growing up when I was young in the 70s, and strikes and shortages and power cuts when the football was on, all of that you can kind of see back to the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. So when things swing one way, they inevitably swing back the other way, and things even themselves out eventually. But I really welcomed my notions of how great that government was by being challenged, not by you saying that government wasn't great necessarily, but by saying that there are alternative visions from conservative leaders, and that conservatism, a small c, has definitely reshaped itself several times during the war by necessity, and that I'm grateful for.
No, thank you. I mean, I think the thing that really comes across is that politics matters. Who is in power matters, and things we haven't really touched on it too much, but military decisions, where Britain fought, what.
Well, let's touch on that for a bit before we go, because that I was going to bring that up, Kit. Is that the various people you talk about had different ideas for not just where the war should be fought, theaters, and we've discussed this channel ad infinitum, the strategic bombing policies, things like that, but how in a political way it should be fought. So just expand on that for a little bit before we bring things to an end.
So I'll kind of frame it as I think we have to take the left seriously. There were people on the left at the time, and particularly in 1940, there were people that were quite, there was talk of a kind of popular revolution, and who were pushing a particular way of fighting the war, which was called a people's war, like a nation in arms. And the idea was that Britain should not focus on high-tech super weapons like Lancaster bombers and the like, but they should have a much, much larger army, and that army should be radically proletarianized. So do away with the kind of stuffy old traditions of the British Army. Look how useless it was in France and in Norway. We need a kind of guerrilla force, like they had during the Spanish Civil War, and it's going to be kind of led by workers, armed workers, and it'll set, we'll work and live. We'll say to our colonies, we're giving up. It's time for you. We'll send you arms. Rise up, people of the world, colonies. There's one book that's called 100 Million Allies If We Choose. So saying that you needed a radical socialist army and a decolonized British Empire, and that there was the only way to win. And this was a kind of serious proposition at the time. And you can see elements of it that get picked up actually in places with kind of the political warfare executive and SOE that kind of draws a little bit on these ideas, albeit in a kind of Tory way. And then there were others, Tories who said, no, this is a terrible idea. We definitely don't want to be like arming the workers. I mean, just think what that does to kind of relations to capital and labour. And, we definitely don't want a mass army. We need to use our kind of financial tools to focus on these amazing high-tech weapons of war, which will have, be controlled by an elite. The Labour, some Labour figures, Bevan actually was like highly critical of the focus on strategic bombing because it's elitist, focusing on the samurai of the sky, as he called them. But Tories actually were quite in favour of that. And the idea also that it would have a much lower death toll than the kind of people in arms approach to fighting, which would consequently have, they thought, less of a kind of socially revolutionary consequence. If you look at the way British society changed in such a fundamental way after the First World War, particularly in kind of gender relations, and economic relations, and they were desperate to avoid that. So you have, this as a way to a better way to fight this kind of liberal militarism, as it was known. I mean, and then others who said, actually, the type of war, what we're doing is madness. We need to go back to kind of the old-fashioned British way of war, kind of offshore balancing, spend all of our money on the navy, protect the home islands, protect the imperial routes. That this is the only way to really preserve the power of the British Empire. Otherwise, we're going to, through our kind of drive to create a mass army and create a mass bombing air force, we're going to bankrupt ourselves and put ourselves in the position of being kind of in hock to the Americans forever after. And so these were, were kind of the way Britain fought, and with kind of what weapons, was often kind of thinking about kind of what type of Britain you wanted during the war, but also crucially afterwards. Not just kind of military strategic kind of decisions. They were deeply political and ideological.
And again, thank you for explaining that, because again, I tend to think of the 1940 to sort of 42 era as really the Allies and Britain only being able to really react to what the enemy are doing, that we're not really in a position to make our own decisions. That comes later on in 43, 44. We can look at maps and go, we'll go there first, then we'll go there. But it's always, reaction in the other. But the fact that, again, your book reminds me that there are these decisions being made about, no, this is the way we can structure our army, our armed forces, this way with, as you say, there go less tech and more people, or more tech and less people. I don't know that I'd realized that these discussions were sort of taking place. I feel that era is typified by just a kind of a knee-jerk response in some ways. Well, bombers are falling on us, so we must do this. We're being overrun. Let's just call up people into the army and get them trained. It's everything is just determined by what the enemy are doing. But yeah, the fact that there are these decisions being brought in, and also, as you said there, they're not just thinking, again, in that first move of the chess game, they're thinking multiple moves down the line. They're thinking about not only will how this affect us right now in 1940 or 41, but when the war comes to an end. And I think, the elephant in the room throughout your book, although it's not an elephant because you invite the elephant in and feed it, is empire and colonialism and how that will eventually sort itself out. Because I think everybody realizes on whatever side of the house that the war will bring about changes to how the empire perceives itself, both kind of collectively, but also country by country, people by people, faith by faith. They're going to come out of this war with some kind of vision for self-determination. So they're all kind of addressing that, and well, let them self-determine within part of us, or self-determine outside of us. And that the point about your book, I'm getting to very long-windedly with my sinners there, is it gave me a lot to think about, and I think that's what I'm going to kind of leave it with. It is an extraordinary book, Kit. I don't say that just to blow smoke up your ass. I read a lot of books, I have a lot of guests, but it completely added a level of my understanding of the war that I didn't know I needed, if that makes sense.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
And folks, I'll hold my copy up again. So there it is. The links are in the description below, or you can buy it at your favorite bookstore or library or wherever your resources for finding books. But honestly, it will definitely change your perception on how you think the British government kind of managed itself in World War II, and the amount of ideas that were being coming out like week by week by people that you probably haven't heard of but should have heard of. So there we are, Kit. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks.
I'm back in a few hours' time with Rick Green, but right now, this is Paul Widows for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Monday. Cheers, everybody. Bye.